Did you ever wonder, why do I hate this thing that I hate? It's an interesting topic because most people don't consider why they hate what they hate. Did you ever wonder that maybe under a different name, such a thing would not be hated? Consider spit. It comes out of your mouth, and some find it disgusting. I don't. But the interesting thing is, I found spittle disgusting. Now, what is spittle? It's just spit, but it's another name. However, I realized that, and in my youth I was somewhat of a disgusting child, that even though I wasn't disgusted by what I considered spit, I was disgusted by what I considered spittle. Eventually, I overcame this dilemma. I think I convinced myself they're the same thing. Or I spit on myself, yes. I think this is what happened. I'm not making this up. And I called the spit spittle. And then I think from that point on, I was no longer disgusted by the concept of spittle. Now imagine how many things in life a person may hate simply because of its name. One other way of thinking about this is categorizing. I believe it's related to the axiom of choice, but don't quote me. Ultimately, we get to decide the categories. So think of animals. There's mammals, which I believe are grouped specifically because they have mammary glands. So breastfeeding. You might have thought, well, I thought it was like giving birth. But the platypus and the echidna both lay eggs and yet are considered mammals. So it's not the giving birth process. But you could come up with, let's say, a different definition. Perhaps a mammal is, an animal that gives birth and doesn't lay eggs. Well, alright. But maybe mammal wouldn't be the right word for it. Or would it? In Hebrew, the word is behem, and that would be used to describe most mammals. But a behem is not a mammal, specifically. You can't map every behem to a mammal, because a behem is really just an animal that walks on all fours on land. So for example, although a whale is a mammal, a whale would not be a behem. Yet, who's to say what the proper distinction is? We could say God has an opinion, but does God care that much about categorizing animals? I would say no. So we could make our own distinctions. We could go with mammal, or we could go with behem, or we could go with something else. And the benefits, well, I have not entirely considered, could be, for example, efficiency. Perhaps there's a better way to list all the animals. Or perhaps the current method with mammal describing some chunk of animals, reptiles another, and so on, is the most efficient way. But perhaps there are other uses too. Perhaps our way of thinking changes if we recategorize. Perhaps there's usefulness. Perhaps we should have multiple ways of categorizing. Perhaps we should use behem and mammal at the same time and have two sets of categories for all the animals. But I think the more interesting fact is that in all of this, our mind could change simply over classifications. And that might not seem like such a big deal, but in essence, you could change how you see the world and also how other people see the world by just changing the rules, thinking differently, categorizing things differently. Probably self-help people have suggested, don't think of a bad day as a bad day. Think of it as a experimental day, a day that was unusual. Okay, but that's not quite what we're talking about. Because I'm not just saying, look in the bad and see the good. I'm saying, what if you just called the bad some other word? Like, blip rip. Yes. And so, how would your mind change in thinking about your day if instead of thinking it as bad, you thought of it as that word I just made up? Strange, isn't it? I think the most extreme example, if you ask me, is Jesus. Now, you could talk to someone, potentially explain all of Christianity to them, and perhaps they would accept it were it not for the word Jesus, because perhaps that name has some sort of negative connotation to them. Perhaps if you used Yeshua instead, they would accept. Or Robert. But everything else is the same. Obviously, it doesn't matter what you call him, Jesus, Yeshua, or Robert. You're still talking about the same person. Yet the effect may be different. I think this is most interesting when considering Orthodox Jewish objections to Christ. So, for example, they might say, well, we don't believe Jesus is the Messiah because we don't believe God would come as a human. But there is the famous story where Jacob gets the name Israel, which is to grab one by the heel, because God appears and wrestles him, and Jacob grabs him by the heel. Or, actually, Jacob means heel grabber, but Israel means struggling. So he gets the name Israel because he struggles with God, because he wrestles with God. And so it's not strange to think God would appear in human form, at least according to the Hebrew Bible. And then another complaint might be, well, maybe it's just weird to have, a woman give birth to God. That's just kind of strange, But then you think, well, there was that man David, right? The king, who was an adulterer and a murderer. And yet he was able to talk to God his whole life. And God never stopped blessing David. And so what is stranger, for a woman to give birth to God, or for God to bless a wicked man? Surely it's more strange for God to bless a wicked man. Some may think, this is disgusting, God being born. But is it not more disgusting for God to forgive people that have done wicked things? No, I think the answer is quite clear. I think ultimately this reminds me of a story I heard from a friend. He worked at a Jewish school, and they had a rule that You couldn't say the name Jesus. Well, it's time to tell my friend how to spread the gospel of Robert.